My name is Rebecca Slayton. I'm the director of the Judith Reppy Institute for Future Conflict Studies, also a professor in the Department of Science and Technology Studies. Today's event is co-sponsored by the Reppy Institute and the South Asia program at Cornell. I want to start with a brief land acknowledgement. Cornell University is located in the traditional homelands of the Gayakono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gayakono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayakono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayakono people, both present and past, to these lands and waters. Now I'm going to introduce our speaker for today. We're delighted to have with us Hafsa Kanjwal, who is an associate professor of South Asian history in the Department of History at Lafayette College. Professor Kanjwal is a historian of modern Kashmir and the author of Colonizing Kashmir, State Building Under Indian Occupation, published just last year with Stanford University Press. Congratulations. I think we may have, do we have copies in the back too? Coffee today. And the book examines how Indian and Kashmir governments utilized state building to entrench India's colonial occupation of Kashmir in the latter half of the 20th century. I think we'll hear more about that today. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for the introduction. Thank you also to the Reppy Institute and the South Asia program at Cornell for inviting me. It's really nice to see all of you. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are over a year into the Israeli genocide of the people of Gaza, as well as the escalation into the West Bank and Lebanon, the complete complicity of the US government. Many of you here may be involved with Palestine solidarity work. I will be talking about Kashmir, but it's also important for us to think broadly about conditions of colonialism, occupation, and settler colonization. As many of you know, the Indian government has been one of Israel's primary allies. This is a reminder that oppressions are linked, but so too are solidarities from the US to Kashmir to Palestine. So I'll talk about my book today, give you sort of a broad overview of some of its main arguments, and also some examples of how some of these policies played out. And I'm looking forward to your questions later on. If you read or hear Indian state officials and commentators talk about the region of Kashmir, you will often hear the phrase that Kashmir is an integral part of India. The repetition reaches a hysterical frenzy and seems to be the one thing that everyone across the political spectrum, from the Nehruvian secularists to the right-wing Hindu nationalists, can agree upon. Challenging this mantra, my book examines how Kashmir was made integral. Building on recent interventions in the field of critical Kashmir studies, Colonizing Kashmir historicizes India's relationship with Kashmir as a colonial occupation and argues that one of the key mechanisms of effective control by which India's colonial occupation of Kashmir in the post-partition period took place was through the installation of client regimes, as well as the particular forms of state building and governance that took place under these regimes. You might be wondering, how can India, a post-colonial state with the most valorized anti-colonial movement against the British, also be a colonial power? Part of what this book aims to do is rethink how we understand colonialism and also how we understand India's state formation. There remains an attachment in scholarship, especially on South Asia, to seeing colonialism as emerging only from the West to the global South and situating our present moment as a decolonial one. This approach fails to account for power dynamics within the global South, such as that between India and Kashmir, as well as the ways in which post-colonial nation states are also colonial. One reason why these forms of colonialism remain obscure is that geographic contiguity, or a sense of an imagined cultural cohesion, disguises colonial dynamics. Instead, these dynamics are seen as natural to nation building, even if their sovereignty is challenged. In other words, the fact that Kashmir is geographically contiguous to India creates the possibility for a less visible kind of colonialism than is possible overseas, such as that between Britain and the subcontinent. But another reason involves methodological nationalism. Decades of work on Kashmir, primarily by Indian scholars, including in the US Academy, have naturalized the Indian nation state form and denied its coloniality, and as a result has examining how this relationship between India and Kashmir was constructed in the first place. This has resulted in what I've referred to as epistemological violence on Kashmir, given the reflection of a colonial commitment to the integrity and the territoriality of the Indian nation state, which is then also akin to the Indian state's own historical narrative that Kashmir is an integral part of India. You can see this with a whole host of scholarship that seeks to explain what led to the armed rebellion of the late 1980s. Every so often, you have the same tiresome articles explaining why Kashmiris are becoming alienated or estranged from India. In this body of work, the Kashmir issue has been reduced to a crisis of federalism, a crisis of democracy, or internal colonialism. The people's longstanding movement for sovereignty has been positioned as separatism, secessionism, ethno-nationalist insurgency, or, of course, terrorism. My book examines how colonialism, settler colonialism, and occupation are all important frameworks to understand India's relationship with Kashmir. That is to say, India uses characteristics of each of these categories to cement its rule in Kashmir over time, and thus it is difficult to say that it is just one or the other. This is important because it encourages us not to see these categories as being in opposition to one another, but rather working in tandem in different moments to achieve particular ends for the state or respond to local forms of resistance. In doing so, I'm not interested in asking why a people who never felt that they belonged suddenly became estranged or alienated. Rather, I'm interested in a set of inverse questions. How did India acquire Kashmir without the popular consent of its people? How did India and its client regimes normalize its occupation both within Kashmir and also for Indian and international audiences? What were the different modalities of rule that were in operation at this time? And finally, what insight can Kashmir provide us in ongoing theorizations of colonialism, settler colonialism, and occupation? To answer these questions, I looked at a decade in Kashmir's recent history from 1953 to 1963. In August 1953, Bakshi Ghulam Mohammad, who's pictured to the left, led a coup against the state of Jammu and Kashmir's first prime minister, Sheikh Abdullah, who you see on the right. At this time, the entire princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, which had its own rich history of an anti-monarchical uprising in the late colonial period, had been divided between the two new nation states of India and Pakistan following the First India-Pakistan War from 1947 to 1948. The United Nations had called for a plebiscite to take place once hostilities ceased, so that Kashmiris could determine their future. Part of the territory, known today as Azad Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan, on the map it's the northern areas, came under Pakistan, while a substantial part came under Indian control. The region referred to as Jammu and Kashmir, Indian occupied Kashmir, or sometimes simply just Kashmir. This is where I conducted my research. And so here it would be specifically in this area and in the valley of Kashmir. Right from 1947, India began to colonize the part of Kashmir under its rule. It placed its own client regimes in power and negotiated some level of autonomy, which was enshrined in Article 370 of the Indian Constitution. The article itself was a colonial treaty meant to placate Kashmir's client regimes into thinking that being under Indian rule would provide them with significant autonomy. It allowed the state to have its own constitution, lawmaking body, and the leader of the state was even called the prime minister, unlike the leader in Indian states who were called chief ministers. Residency rights of land ownership and employment were also restricted to Kashmir state subjects. The Indian government was just supposed to be in charge of communications, defense, and foreign affairs. Yet the first prime minister, Sheikh Abdullah, who had initially agreed to Kashmir's accession to India, began to backtrack. He was increasingly concerned with rising Hindu nationalism, as well as the Indian government's attempts to grow the agreed upon autonomy of the Kashmir state by moving beyond their restricted mandate. was removed in a coup by India in 1953 and replaced by his deputy. Bakshi was in power for a decade from 1953 to 1963. A shrewd politician, Bakshi had been a ground worker for the Abdullah-led National Party and so was very familiar with local politics. The Indian government tasked Bakshi with promoting Kashmir's contested accession to India domestically and internationally, while repressing popular political aspirations for merger with Pakistan or independence. After violently quashing protests that arose in the aftermath of Sheikh Abdullah's arrest, Bakshi turned his attention to state building and implemented a number of economic and educational policies. During his time in power, the Kashmir Assembly, which was an undemocratic entity that was filled with loyalists of Bakshi, confirmed Kashmir's accession to India and sought greater financial and administrative integration with the Indian Union, undermining Kashmir's autonomy. Bakshi's period oversaw crucial shifts in India's political and economic relationship with Kashmir towards concrete material integration. Yet he knew that that for this relationship and his rule to be legitimized, Kashmiris had to be convinced that this relationship was in their best interests, and they had to develop an emotional bond in favor of India. Bakshi was also compelled to respond to the economic and social aspirations of the people, especially Kashmir's Muslim majority population, who had long suffered unjust economic and social marginalization under their princely rulers. What is astounding about his state building project is that he left no stone unturned in transforming the state and utilized a range of actors, from bureaucrats to educators, the cultural intelligentsia, workers, peasants, tourism operators, and Indian filmmakers for this purpose. With financial assistance from the government of India, the Kashmir government established a number of public institutions and development projects, including schools and colleges and universities, hospitals, roads, tunnels, irrigation and power projects, as well as cultural centers, stadiums, and social welfare organizations. So the image that you see here is from the 1956 inauguration of the Banehal Tunnel. And this is a tunnel that connected the Indian mainland with the Kashmir Valley, because otherwise there's the Himalayan mountains in between. And before this tunnel, there was no all year round way to get from the mainland to the Kashmir Valley, because the road that had been constructed in the early 1900s was shut for most of the year or half of the year because of snow. And that's because Kashmir's main transportation or trade networks were actually with what then became Pakistan and different parts of Central Asia. So there really was no link in that way further south, which is India. And so this tunnel was built by the Bakshi government, but most of it was funded by the Indian government. And it was basically to create this tunnel that went directly through the mountains. It was obviously an extremely expensive project. They had to get 2 German engineers to kind of construct this. And even at this speech at the inauguration, Bakshi's standing here, and he says something to the effect of, this is actually going to create an all year round emotional integration between the people of India and the people, right? So that's kind of the intended effect of what this infrastructure was about. So when I began my PhD research around a decade ago, I found that most of the scholarship on Kashmir primarily focused on the events surrounding the 1947 partition, and then the period after the late 1980s, when an armed rebellion and mass popular uprising began in Kashmir against the Indian state. There was very little critical scholarship to help us understand what happened in between those 2 periods, that of 1947 and partition and the late 1980s. And so I was drawn to that period. The dominant narrative about this period, both to a certain extent in popular memory, as well as in scholarship, is that things were normal during this time, and that it was only because of Pakistan's later interference or India's lack of commitment to development or secularism or democracy that Kashmiris became disillusioned, leading to the rebellion and intense militarization and human rights violations committed by the Indian Army. Now, we may associate development works and efforts at prosperity by the state by building roads, tunnels, increasing employment opportunities, and enhancing tourism as laudable things for the people of a region. But I argue that it is precisely through the ruse of state building that India colonized Kashmir through client leaders like Bakshi. The decade that Bakshi was in power actually consolidated the contours of India's colonial occupation by relying on those very same discourses and practices of development, secularism, integration, normalization, and democracy. And I historicize India's occupation and show that it may have looked different in this time period in comparison to what happened in the late 1980s with the brutal militarization, but it was still very much involved in suppressing Kashmiri demands for self-determination. So the different chapters in the book look at the ways in which India's colonial occupation operated through Bakshi's state-building practices as a client regime, and specifically through international diplomacy, film, tourism, education, economic development, and cultural reform. So the two photos that you see on this slide are also from 1956. It's a visit by the Soviet leaders, Khrushchev and Bulganin, who, upon the invitation of Nehru, the Prime Minister of India, and Bakshi, came to Kashmir to visit the region and see the kinds of developments that were happening in the state. And so when they were there, as you can see, Bakshi took them around in like a cavalcade. There were crowds on both sides. He fed them a Kashmiri meat delicacy called kushtaba. They saw dances, they saw development projects, they saw different schools that had been recently opened up. And when the Soviet leaders went back to the Soviet Union, they gave an announcement or a press conference basically saying that, well, we went to Kashmir and we saw that the people were happy. And, you know, it seems that the plebiscite issue is final and India has taken over. India has ruled Kashmir. And in any subsequent UN meetings on Kashmir, because Kashmir was still an international dispute that was being discussed at the United Nations, the Soviet Union, having veto power, would veto any subsequent UN resolution on Kashmir. And so this visit was obviously a huge strategic win for both Bakshi, but as well as the Indian government. And what's interesting for me is, you know, I looked at these pictures, I saw these pictures, I imagined that, you know, and when you look at them, you can get the sense that, okay, maybe it does look like things are normal. But when I actually did an oral interview with someone who was at the protest, or not the protest, but the, you know, the lines of people who were lined up against the car, they told me that the government had basically told people, especially in rural areas, to come into the city for the day, and they had promised them a free lunch. So a ride to the city and a free lunch. And all they had to do was stand by the banks of the river, and when the car came by, they just had to cheer. They didn't know who they were cheering for or what they were doing, but they thought that they were getting a free lunch. And so what they were able to create this spectacle of, you know, joy and elation of being under Indian rule for these Soviet leaders, and that's why they've had this impression that, you know, they must be fine. So all that to say, I mean, the level of propaganda was actually really important for perception management for India's rule, and it still persists today. So I won't have time to go through all of the chapters, but I wanted to highlight two main themes that I think are important to just give you some examples of how all of this took place. So the first is the politics of life. And to give you a sense of how this played out, I'll share a brief anecdote with you. So in a conversation with an elder in Kashmir during my fieldwork, I was told about a particular high-ranking Kashmiri bureaucrat who had recently passed away. The relative mentioned that the person had not been very educated. He'd only passed matric or the equivalent of 10th grade. But he had been given a clerical job by Bakshi, who had written his job appointment on a matchbox. As oral histories go, there had been many in the 1950s and 1960s who would come across Bakshi in his visits to their towns or villages, and he, after asking them if they had a job, would write to them on appointments on slips of paper, or more notably, on matchboxes. In these early years of India's colonial occupation in Kashmir, the Indian government and its client regime saw the Kashmir issue not in political terms, meaning not a question of sovereignty or self-determination, but rather in economic terms, linked to a better standard of living. Kashmiris were depicted as being malleable, that while they may have had varying political aspirations, they had the potential to be integrated subjects as long as they could experience the benefits of Indian rule. So both governments thought that Kashmiri sentiments could be managed and in many ways bought through state planning. and they attempted to show Kashmiris the many benefits they could incur under India, well beyond what was possible under any other political setup, and also well beyond what was provided to Indian states. And so I argue that the early decades of India's colonial occupation were marked by a politics of life. Borrowing the term from the scholar Nev Gordon, who uses it similarly to describe how Israel attempted to create prosperity in the West Bank and Gaza Strip after the 1967 war by promoting agriculture, building trees, permitting Palestinians to build colleges, and even boasting of having raised the calorie intake amongst Gazans. The politics of life refers to how the Indian government and Kashmir's client regimes propagated development, empowerment, and progress to secure the well-being of Kashmir's population and to normalize occupation for multiple audiences, including internationally. It entailed foregrounding the day-to-day concerns of employment, food, education, and provision of basic services. At the same time, as in Palestine, questions of self-determination and Kashmir's political future were being suppressed. This approach to Kashmir was furthered by the Indian leadership, including the first Prime Minister Nehru, as well as Kashmir's client regimes. In a letter to Sheikh Abdullah, which is how I actually start the book, Nehru writes, "It must be remembered that the people of the Kashmir Valley and roundabout, though highly gifted in many ways, in intelligence, in artisanship, etc., are not what we call a virile people. They are soft and addicted to easy living. The common people are primarily interested in a few things, an honest administration and cheap and adequate food. If they get this, then they are more or less content." Nehru also once reportedly said that, quote, "India would bind Kashmir in golden chains," end quote. And it did. The government intended to ensure that with an improved standard of living and greater prosperity, Kashmiri Muslim sentiments would shift in favor of India towards a form of emotional integration. Colonial and occupying powers utilize a variety of modalities of control in regions they have colonized or where their legitimacy is challenged. One mechanism is shifting from indirect rule to direct rule, as the British did with India after the 1857 rebellion. In my research, I observed how India engaged with the politics of life as well as more necro-political modalities of control in Kashmir, sometimes even at the same time. Other times, one would be given more focus than the other. While a state governing through death or life may appear to be in contradiction, it is actually not. The idea is to entrench colonial rule, to transform political subjectivities depending on the context, and this can be done either through manifest violence or through strategies that seek to win hearts and minds. So how were these seeming state-building measures in fact instruments of Indian colonization of Kashmir? For that, let's turn to rice. A member of the Kashmir cabinet under Bakshi, named D.P. Dar, propounded the theory that, quote, Kashmiris knew little of politics. What they cared about was a hearty meal, and they could be won over gastronomically. You can start to see some of these themes recurring. Abdullah was invested in financial autonomy for Kashmir, and he had told Kashmiris that they should rather survive on a diet of potatoes before relying on rice subsidies from India. Immediately after his arrest and to quell the protests, Bakshi's government received agricultural subsidies from India, drastically decreasing the price of rice and grains. It is estimated that rice subsidies under Abdullah were nearly 2 million rupees. Under Bakshi, they reached almost 16 million rupees per year, and that was all met by the Indian government. And so the price of rice dramatically went down in urban areas and villages. And sometimes when there was bad weather or there was a drought, the government of India also would send emergency allotments of rice. But what's really interesting about the story of rice and the politics around rice is that Bakshi managed to leverage the threat of political instability, as well as the geopolitical significance of Kashmir for India's reputation internationally, to secure an ongoing and high amount of food aid. For example, between 1956 to 1957, officials in the Ministry of Food were aghast that the Kashmir government would continue to request such high amounts, even as the production of rice was increasing within the state. The Indian government was willing to give 20,000 tons, but not the 36,700 tons that the Kashmir government was requesting. Indian government officials repeatedly requested that the Kashmir government increase the price of subsidized rice locally so that there could be a reduced demand. But Bakshi would protest, stating that the food supply remained perilous, especially after crops had been damaged by floods and hailstorms. He also repeatedly stated that the position of Jammu and Kashmir was materially different from other states, and that there were other political factors that the government of India should not risk with this state, as numerous political implications were involved in the distribution of rice at reduced prices. Eventually, the Indian Ministry of Home would write to the Ministry of Food and Agriculture, requesting it to take into consideration the special circumstance of the state, and then additional tons of rice would be deployed to the state. This example highlights how integral the rice policy in Kashmir was to India's colonial occupation. Providing rice at such low prices in Kashmir was in sharp contrast to the government of India's overall food policy that relied on scarcity and self-reliance, which suggests the need for the government of India to have a different development policy in Kashmir than they did in Indian states. But it also shows how Bakshi was able to leverage political instability in Kashmir to get the best deal for food aid for Kashmir, oftentimes to the sheer dismay of some Indian officials. Bakshi envisioned a political economy in which Kashmir would receive ongoing aid from the Indian government. As a result, his was a time of plenty. To get the most from the Indian government, all Bakshi had to do was refer to the political sensibilities or sensitivities or compulsions he was subject to. The provision of aid in abundance under India was intended to remake sentiments towards India and provide legitimacy to Bakshi's government. Kashmiris could see for themselves the real tangible benefits of joining with India. They would likely consent to its rule. This is fundamentally how the politics of life operated. In subsequent years, the diets of Kashmiris, especially in rural areas, began to change and rely heavily on rice. Rice became associated with a mark of social status, and the flood of rice into Kashmir during Bakshi's time remains one of his lasting legacies. In fact, when my own diaspora sensibilities were amazed that some family members in Kashmir eat rice not once, not twice, but sometimes 3 times a day, I was told to take it up with Bakshi. What I think is really significant in this is that greater financial integration with India is something that the Kashmir government under Bakshi forced the Indian metropole to concede. Colonial occupation then is not always a top-down process, but one that can encourage those in the middle, a comprador or collaborator class, to further and manipulate. And this explains in part why it often becomes intractable. Now, the reason why the politics of life is important is that when we often look at colonial or settler colonial contexts, the common understanding is these are areas of immense dispossession, violence, war, and marginalization. And we've certainly seen that on our screens for the past year or so. And of course, many times they are, and that has been a story in Kashmir for decades as well. But then only seeing colonialism as being defined by manifest violence obscures our understanding of the other ways in which it operates, through giving, development, and empowerment, the banality of everyday life. This is what defined the early decades of India's rule in Kashmir. As a result of such policies, India was able to position Kashmir as a begging bowl and itself as singularly capable of providing the people their livelihood, entrenching its colonial occupation of Kashmir through fiscal and not direct military means. The second theme I want to discuss regards secularism, and what exactly secularism entails if India's secular credentials are grounded in the context of a colonial occupation. Indian leaders like Nehru would basically say that India's secular ideals are exemplified through its only Muslim majority state, Jammu and Kashmir. You might think then, when it came to representations of Kashmir in the broader discursive domain, Kashmir's Muslim histories or geographies might at least be made reference to, especially if they were supposed to have upheld Indian secularism. But this was not the case. To say that Kashmir was a Muslim majority region that had chosen to join India was good PR largely for international audiences, especially with the rivalry with Pakistan. Yet domestically, in secular nationalist imaginaries of Kashmir, Kashmir was presented as a Hindu space and the heart of Indian civilization from the ancient to present times. How then do we make sense of Indian secularism at this time? My book argues that Indian secularism and Hindu majoritarianism are inextricable to one another. I show how Hindu geographies, imaginaries, and histories, especially through the sole reliance on the 12th century Sanskrit text, the Rajatangini by Kalhana, were central to secular discourses, Producing a good Kashmiri secular subject, I argue, was deployed as a mechanism to criminalize Muslim political aspirations or alternate visions of nationhood and belonging. Ultimately, Kashmiri Muslims were politically useful for India's secular politics of inclusion, but this forcible inclusion is aligned with assimilationist settler colonial narratives about Kashmir's history and recent past. As the book shows, the secular was used to both erase and clean Muslim histories of Kashmir. One of the ways in which this came about was through film and tourism. Film and tourism have served in many ways to territorialize India's colonial occupation in Kashmir and continue to do so. Both sought to produce Indian colonial desires, anxieties, and claims over the occupied territory and define the place on India's terms. Dozens of leading Indian films from this time were made in Kashmir, and Kashmir was often referred to as the top tourist destination in India. It was a place to be seen and experienced, even if just through the cinematic lens, and in turn to claim. The use of tourism, in particular to enable colonialism, is not restricted to Kashmir. In this 1952 ad from the State of Hawaii Visitors Bureau, you can see some of the ways in which that tourism adds to Hawaii function to create a space of gendered desire. And there were others for Kashmir that did the same. And both ads also specify the year-round activities that visitors could do once they come to these places. And in both of these posters, one of the things that I saw that was similar is also this directive to come now here and then come now as well. And so there's this urgency to come to this place. And many of the ads also spoke to how easy now, here you can see the Hawaii one, you can fly or you can sail. Similar with Kashmir, they would have like only an hour and a half flight from Delhi, just how easy it was actually to get to these places. And so this continues until the present. This is an ad from 2020, after the Indian government pronounced that Kashmir was reopened for tourism since the abrogation, which I'll get to later on in my talk. And so here Kashmir was calling, and also here in the 1950s, Kashmir was calling. So it's been calling for using film and tourism specifically, I argue that representations of Kashmiri history and identity were selective, partial, and distorting, ignoring complex historical processes and providing a simplified narrative of Kashmir's natural incorporation into the Indian nation. In their travels, Indian tourists saw and experienced Kashmir in ways that legitimated India's symbolic claims over Kashmir and promoted the naturalization of Indian empire on colonized land. In tourist guidebooks, Kashmir's Muslim histories were either completely erased or relegated, as with what happened across the subcontinent, to stories of invaders. For example, Muslim rulers were referred to as conquerors, whereas earlier Hindu or Buddhist rulers, despite their varied origins, were seen as indigenous to Kashmir. Muslim sacred sites were given a brief, if any, mention, while Hindu sacred sites were central to the tourist experience. Few of the Kashmir films even depicted any Kashmiri Muslim characters. And this is striking given that this was a Muslim majority region. The ones that did were either simplistic and rustic, like Mamdu in the film Arzu, or Raja, who's played by Shashi Kapoor in the film Jab Jab Phool Khile. Raja's character was seen as paradoxically in need of integration to India, but also ultimately the authentic Indian subject. It was also during this time when Hindu religious tourism to Kashmir was strengthened. As one guidebook mentioned, Kashmir was a holy land for Hindus. Banaras, which is technically considered the holy land for Hindus, stands as a molehill before a mountain. Many guidebooks had a special section on the Amarnath pilgrimage, heightening the significance of Kashmir for the Hindu faithful. Why is this significant? Scholars of settler colonialism have argued that not all states eliminate subject populations by killing them off or driving them off the land. Elimination can also occur by assimilation, or what I call integration in the book, where the idea is to rid the people of their own sense of history and identity and bring them into line with the settler colonial state. In this case, India's politics of secular inclusion was linked to the erasure or taming of Muslimness by making Kashmir exclusively a Hindu holy land. And this is what tied it intimately to processes of settler colonialism in order to legitimate India's claims over Kashmir. Different aspects of the state building project created their own subversions. Bakshi himself was replaced by the Indian government once he stopped serving their purpose. This is the fate of Kashmir's client politicians up until today. Even though his time in power completely entrenched the legal, political, economic, and social infrastructure of colonial occupation, it did not succeed in emotionally integrating Kashmiris to India. In fact, the decades after his rule led to even greater movements for self-determination. Even if the chains are golden, they will still need to be broken. I wanted to end this overview by bringing it all to the present. Many of you may know that on August 5th, 2019, India embarked on the next phase of its settler colonial project in Kashmir by formally revoking Kashmir's semi-autonomous status. It is not an exaggeration to say that in the past 5 years, Kashmiris have been effectively silenced, as India has changed a series of laws to allow its citizens and armed forces to buy land and settle in the Muslim majority region in order to change its demographics in favor of Hindus, and then subsequently quash the movements for liberation. These developments are happening under a brutal neoliberal order, which is also making Kashmir a site of global extraction and environmental destruction. In recent years, the Indian government has completely gone after all forms of potential dissent in Kashmir, from imprisoning the pro-freedom leadership to targeting writers, journalists, artists, academics, human rights defenders, and activists in a variety of ways, and creating new forms of propaganda. Writing or saying anything that portrays the Indian government's actions in a negative light, forget even speaking about freedom or liberation, is a cause for harassment, interrogation, and imprisonment. Much of this is also being replicated in India as political developments under Modi's Hindu nationalist government have led to fears of genocide against Indian Muslims, as well as an increased realization of their second-class status. Examining Indian state formation from the perspective of Kashmir sheds light on what is usually called India's descent into an authoritarian, undemocratic, Hindu majoritarian state. In scholarship and advocacy efforts against Hindu nationalism, there's a tendency to reinforce the idea that India was once secular, once pluralistic and democratic, but has now been transformed into this ethno-nationalist state that commits human rights violations. There's of course no question that the rise of Hindu nationalism has exacerbated India's challenges and that things have categorically gotten worse. Yet, with this increasing nostalgia for an earlier version of India as a result of rampant Hindu nationalism in India today, the inherent violence of that secular liberal order, as well as its entanglements with Hindu majoritarianism, is erased. This nostalgia completely erases how colonialism and domination were at the root of Indian state formation, not just in Kashmir, but in other places as well. More importantly, Kashmir and the other regions at the margins or frontiers of the national narrative were not an exception, but remain integral to India's state formation as a colonial power. To put it simply, India's foundational moment cannot be viewed as separate from its colonial occupation of Kashmir. In some ways, we can see Kashmir and other zones of colonial occupation as a test case for the Indian state to practice various forms of power: disciplinary, sovereign, biopolitical, and necropolitical. These strategies would then be utilized in the mainland too, especially against populations that are deemed a threat: Muslims, Dalits, and tribal communities, and more recently, anyone who does not align with the Hindu nationalist project. Zones of colonial occupation help us think about how nation states can slide into varying political formations, because it is often these zones that go from being a state of exception to the norm. Therefore, instead of looking for inspiration in a rather uninspiring past, would it not be better to envision more imaginative and liberatory futures? And finally, even though this book aims to shed light on Kashmir's history, my hope is that it will be useful to other sites that are like Kashmir. One of my main hopes is that this book will contribute towards a historiography of states that do not exist, have not been allowed to exist, and peoples who have been denied self-determination and the right to exercise their sovereignty. And there are many. Kashmir is not exceptional. A number of other nations and communities have been brought into the fold of nation states without their consent, or remain under colonial occupation, apartheid, and war. Modern-day borders do not adhere to people's understandings of place and history. And so modern nation states have used varying modalities of control, whether manifest violence or the politics of life, to establish their rule in these places where they lack legitimacy. But people have and continue to resist.